Long before written history settled into stone and clay, there were stories of beings who did not rule through kings or armies, but through order itself. They were said to arrive before cities, before laws, before humanity learned to plan its own future. Ancient texts call them the Anunnaki, not gods in the later sense, but overseers, figures tied to labor, balance, and control. Then, without ceremony or collapse, they faded from the world's decisions. No final battle was recorded. No departure was announced. Civilization continued, but something had changed. Authority moved inward. Silence replaced command. Tonight, we explore a question rarely asked directly. Not whether the Anunnaki existed, but whether humanity outgrew them. Whether a quiet rebellion of organization, planning, and self-rule made overseers unnecessary. And whether the systems that replaced them still carry their shadow. This is not a story of destruction, but of transition. A slow shift that reshaped everything. The quiet arrival of the Anunnaki. Long before written history settled into clay tablets and carved stone, stories moved slowly through memory. They were not told to explain, but to preserve. In the oldest layers of Mesopotamian tradition, before kings were counted and years measured, there appeared beings described as older than cities and heavier than time. They were called the Anunnaki. The name itself appears in Sumerian texts as early as the late 4th millennium BCE, translated loosely as those who came from heaven to earth. The phrase was not poetic, it was administrative. It appeared in lists, genealogies, and ritual instructions, not in myths meant for children. The earliest references place them before the rise of organized human labor. In the Eridu Genesis, fragments dated to around 2300 BCE, but referencing far older traditions, the Anunnaki are described as decision makers, not creators. They allocate land, they assign tasks, they judge disputes between lesser gods. Humanity appears later in these texts, not as a miracle, but as a solution. Labor was required, extraction was necessary, the earth was heavy, and the work was slow. One tablet recovered from Nippur describes a moment of strain among the divine ranks. The Igigi, a working class of deities, are said to have revolted after long service. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil at night, carrying tools instead of weapons. The text does not describe a battle, it records a negotiation. The solution proposed was the creation of a substitute workforce. Humans were formed, according to the account, from clay mixed with the essence of a slain god named Geshtu-e. The detail is precise. A sacrifice occurred. Something ended, so something else could begin. What is notable is what the text does not celebrate. There is no triumph, no divine joy. The tone remains procedural. Work must continue. Order must be restored. Humanity is introduced as an instrument, not a triumph of love or design. This framing appears again in later Akkadian and Babylonian versions of the myth, including the Atrahasis epic, dated to around 1800 BCE. In these accounts, humans multiply quickly, noise increases. The gods grow restless. Over time, the relationship shifts. Humans are no longer passive. They build cities. They organize. They develop ritual language. They remember names. Temples rise at Eridu, Uruk, and Lagash. Offerings are standardized. Calendars are refined. The gods are fed through smoke and sound. The Anunnaki remain present, but more distant. Their roles become symbolic, their movements slow. By the time of the Old Babylonian period, around 1900 BCE, something subtle has changed. The Anunnaki are no longer described as walking among humans. They preside from above or below. Some are associated with the underworld, others with fixed celestial positions. The word Anunnaki begins to overlap with terms for judges of the dead. This shift is quiet but consistent across multiple sources. One inscription, attributed to King Lipit Ishtar, includes a line often translated as, "The Anunnaki no longer decide the fate of men." The phrase is brief and unexplained. No reason is given. There is no account of departure. There is no war recorded. The absence is treated as a fact, not an event. Later, Assyrian texts, especially those from the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, preserve older stories but change their framing. The Anunnaki are presented as figures of a distant age. Their authority is historical, not active. Ritual texts invoke them as witnesses, not participants. The living world is governed by different names. This gradual retreat raises an uncomfortable question. What caused it? There is no tablet that records a rebellion led by humans against their makers. There is no epic of uprising. Yet the myths preserve fragments that suggest strain. In the Atrahasis epic, humans become too numerous. Their cities disturb the sleep of Enlil. Plagues are sent. Drought follows. Flood is proposed. The measures are severe, but they fail to restore balance permanently. Some scholars have noted that the gods appear increasingly reactive in these stories. They respond rather than command. They negotiate among themselves. They argue. Enki repeatedly undermines Enlil's plans to reduce humanity. He warns humans through dreams. He teaches survival. This internal division suggests instability. A line from Tablet III of Atrahasis states, "The gods were frightened by their own decisions." The wording is unusual. Fear is rarely attributed to divine beings in early texts. The sentence is not expanded upon. It remains as written. By the time flood narratives enter Hebrew traditions centuries later, the Anunnaki are no longer named. The divine council remains, but its members are fewer. The world is reset. Humanity continues. The older overseers are gone. Archaeologically, this period coincides with rapid human autonomy. After 3000 BCE, cities grow larger without corresponding increases in ritual complexity. Monumental architecture becomes human-centered. Kings claim divine favor, but not divine supervision. Law codes emphasize order without celestial enforcement. Something has stepped back. The idea that humanity killed the Anunnaki does not appear directly in any ancient source. What appears instead is withdrawal following loss of control. The gods do not die, they fade, they descend. They become judges of shadows rather than rulers of soil. In later texts from Hellenistic Babylon, the Anunnaki are associated with the underworld gates. They count the dead, they do not intervene. Their power is passive, their numbers are fixed. One final fragment, damaged but legible, describes a time when the bonds were broken and the voices fell silent. No names follow, no explanation survives. The rebellion, if it occurred, may not have been violent. It may have been structural. Humanity organized itself. Memory replaced instruction. Ritual replaced command. The Anunnaki were no longer necessary. What remains is not evidence of destruction, but of replacement. Authority shifted. Systems changed. The old overseers were left behind, not buried, but unused. The silence that follows is complete. Their names remain carved in stone, but their actions stop. The war that was never written. In the earliest civilizations, history was not a neutral record of events. It was a controlled surface. What appeared on clay, stone, or papyrus reflected what power allowed to remain visible. Scribes were not historians in the modern sense. They were custodians of order. Their task was not to document disruption, but to maintain continuity. Because of this, the most important events are often found not in what was written, but in what was omitted. Across Sumer, Akkad, and later Babylon, warfare was recorded in detail. Campaigns were named. Enemy cities were listed. Spoils were counted. Even failed military ventures were preserved. though often reframed as honorable struggles or divinely constrained outcomes. Yet when examining the transition in which the Anunnaki ceased to act as direct overseers of humanity, no such record exists. There is no tablet announcing judgment against them, no inscription marking their defeat, no lamentation for their passing. Instead, the texts simply continue without them. This absence is unusual. The Anunnaki were not minor figures. They were embedded in administrative theology. Their names appear in land grants, temple instructions, legal formulas, and oath ceremonies. Removing them from governance would have required explanation, yet none is given. The change is gradual but consistent. In early Sumerian texts, particularly those from the Uruk period, offerings are explicitly directed to the Anunnaki as a collective authority. Ritual language often includes phrases equivalent to "as decreed by the Anunnaki." These formulations imply active decision-making. They suggest presence. By the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE, the language begins to thin. The phrase "as decreed" remains, but the source of the decree is sometimes omitted. The ritual continues. The justification fades. This pattern suggests that authority has shifted from a named source to an assumed structure. In human institutions, such linguistic drift often accompanies political change. When a ruling body loses relevance, its name becomes ceremonial before disappearing entirely. The process is quiet. It avoids rupture. The Atrahasis epic provides a partial glimpse into the pressure behind this shift. In this narrative, humans are created to relieve divine labor. They succeed too well. Population increases. Cities expand. Noise becomes a metaphor for autonomy. The gods attempt corrective measures, but these measures rely on cooperation. Plague, famine, and flood require secrecy to function. Once humans learn how to respond, the tools lose effectiveness. The epic describes repeated cycles of suppression followed by recovery. Each cycle ends with humanity more resilient than before. The gods respond with frustration rather than authority. Enlil complains. Enki intervenes. Consensus breaks down. A line from one fragment reads, "The council was divided, and the words did not return as one." The phrasing is technical, almost bureaucratic. It does not describe emotion. It describes failure of coordination. Division within a ruling class is often more dangerous than rebellion below. When authority cannot agree, enforcement collapses. Humans do not need to overthrow such a system. They simply need to continue. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. After 3000 BCE, city planning becomes standardized. Irrigation systems are expanded and maintained across generations. Legal codes appear. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to around 2100 BCE, outlines justice without divine intervention in daily rulings. The gods are invoked as guarantors, not participants. This shift suggests that humans no longer rely on direct oversight. They have internalized structure. The Anunnaki remain present in name, but their function changes. They are increasingly associated with the underworld. Texts, such as the Descent of Inanna, describe them as judges who sit silently. They do not initiate action. They respond only when summoned. This relocation is symbolic. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief is not a place of punishment. It is a place of finality. What enters does not return. Assigning the Anunnaki to this realm removes them from influence without denying their existence. Political systems often use similar strategies. Former rulers are granted honorary titles. They are respected but isolated. Their presence legitimizes the present without threatening it. There are no signs of violent removal, no destruction of temples dedicated to the Anunnaki, no erasure of their names. Instead, their relevance declines through disuse. In Assyrian records from the 1st millennium BCE, the Anunnaki are invoked during funerary rituals. They receive the dead. They do not rule the living. Their authority is retrospective. The war that was never written may therefore not have been a war in the conventional sense. It may have been a systemic failure, a collapse of necessity. Humans no longer needed overseers to manage labor. Agriculture had stabilized. Trade networks extended beyond divine mapping. Writing itself had become a tool of governance independent of myth. Once humans could record, calculate, and enforce, external authority became redundant. This redundancy is visible in royal inscriptions. Early kings claim appointment by gods. Later kings claim divine nature themselves. The intermediary vanishes. The role is absorbed. In Egypt, this process is especially clear. Predynastic rulers are described as chosen by gods. By the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh is Horus incarnate. There is no council above him. The divine hierarchy collapses into a single figure. This consolidation mirrors what may have occurred globally. The Anunnaki, once a collective authority, are replaced by singular human rulers who claim their mandate. The absence of conflict records suggests that this transition was managed, not fought. Violence leaves debris. Administrative change leaves silence. Some later myths hint at resentment. In a fragment from Sippar, a god laments that humans walk without instruction. The line ends without continuation. It reads less like accusation and more like observation. Another text refers to a time when the tablets of fate no longer passed between hands. The phrase implies stasis. Authority froze. If the Anunnaki depended on humanity for relevance, their power would diminish as humans organized themselves. Worship sustains gods. When worship becomes ritual rather than reliance, the relationship changes. The gradual nature of this process explains the lack of catastrophe narratives. There was no single moment to record, no battle to commemorate, only a slow replacement of function. Later civilizations inherit the names but not the structure. Greek writers encounter Mesopotamian gods as distant figures. Roman authors classify them as myth. The living presence is gone. The Anunnaki do not die in the texts. They are not slain. They are reassigned, reduced, and eventually ignored. In systems of control, irrelevance is more final than destruction. The war that was never written may have been fought through adaptation. Through knowledge, through time, humanity did not strike. It continued. And in continuing, it rendered the old overseers unnecessary. When the gods were replaced by kings, in the earliest cities, authority was layered. Power did not belong to one figure. It moved between temples, councils, and ritual calendars. Decisions were framed as outcomes of divine agreement rather than human command. The Anunnaki, as a collective, embodied this system. They were not rulers in the personal sense. They were a structure. Their authority existed above individual will. As human societies grew more complex, this structure became inefficient. Cities expanded beyond ritual centers. Populations increased. Trade routes connected regions that did not share the same gods. Coordination required speed. Consensus among unseen overseers slowed response. Human leaders began to fill the gap. The first kings did not rule openly. They acted as intermediaries. Titles such as Ensi and Lugal appear in Sumerian records as early as 2800 BCE. These figures were administrators, not monarchs. They managed irrigation, organized labor, and enforced agreements. Their authority was described as granted by the gods, not inherent. Early inscriptions emphasize obedience. A ruler acts on behalf of a deity. He builds temples, he restores canals, he maintains balance. The gods remain the source of legitimacy. The human ruler remains secondary. Over time, this balance shifts. The language changes subtly. In inscriptions from the reign of Eannatum of Lagash, dated to around 2450 BCE, the king is described not only as chosen by the gods, but as executing their will without consultation. He does not wait for signs, he acts. This is not rebellion, it is assumption. As kings take on more responsibility, divine oversight becomes symbolic. The Anunnaki are no longer named individually in political texts. Their authority is absorbed into abstract concepts such as fate, order, and destiny. These ideas do not argue, they do not divide, they do not resist. The consolidation accelerates during the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE. Sargon claims divine favor, but he rules through military force and administrative control. His inscriptions emphasize conquest, not ritual. The gods approve after the fact. Sargon does not consult a council of gods. He invokes Ishtar alone. Singular divine backing replaces collective authority. This mirrors political reality. One ruler replaces many overseers. By the time of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, the transition is explicit. Naram-Sin declares himself a god. He places a divine determinative before his name. This act is unprecedented. It does not reference the Anunnaki, it bypasses them entirely. This moment marks a structural shift. Authority no longer flows downward from a divine council. It originates in the ruler and radiates outward. The gods become attributes of kingship rather than its source. Resistance to this change is minimal in the records. There are no texts condemning Naram-Sin for blasphemy. Later, scribes criticize his arrogance, but the system remains. Deification becomes acceptable. This acceptance suggests that the divine hierarchy was already weakened. The Anunnaki no longer functioned as enforcers. Without enforcement, their approval became optional. The same pattern appears in Egypt. Early dynastic rulers are described as servants of the gods. By the third dynasty, the pharaoh is Horus on earth. There is no divine council above him. The older pantheon becomes ceremonial. Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom rarely mention divine disagreement. The gods support the king by default. The pharaoh embodies order. He does not negotiate it. This consolidation of power aligns with architectural changes. Monumental structures become centered on the ruler. Pyramids dominate landscapes. Temples serve royal cults. The human figure becomes the axis. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rise as symbolic mountains. They connect earth and sky, but they are controlled by kings. Access is restricted. Ritual becomes centralized. The people do not approach the gods directly. The ruler mediates. As mediation becomes routine, oversight becomes redundant. The Anunnaki remain in myth, but their practical role disappears. Legal systems reflect this transition. The Code of Ur-Nammu and later the Code of Hammurabi present law as divinely inspired but humanly enforced. Judges answer to the king. The king answers only to abstract justice. Hammurabi's stele depicts the king receiving law from Shamash, not from a council. The image is singular. Authority flows one way. This narrowing of divine representation simplifies governance. It removes internal divine conflict from political reality. Humans no longer witness gods disagreeing. The system becomes stable. The Anunnaki, as a collective, do not fit into this model. Their power depends on plurality. Kingship depends on unity. As kings absorb divine roles, the Anunnaki are reassigned. They appear in funerary texts. They judge the dead. They maintain cosmic order beyond life. Their jurisdiction is removed from daily affairs. This reassignment preserves tradition while neutralizing influence. The gods are honored, but they do not interfere. Over generations, this becomes normal. Children grow up under human rulers who claim divine nature. The old overseers become distant ancestors. By the first millennium BCE, references to the Anunnaki are rare and formulaic. They appear in incantations and burial rites. They do not appear in political strategy. The transition is complete. Gods have not vanished. They have been repurposed. Human kings now command labor, war, and law. Divine authority legitimizes but does not direct. The center of power is human. This shift does not require conflict. It requires continuity. Each generation inherits a system slightly more human-centered than the last. The replacement of gods by kings is not a rejection of belief. It is an optimization of control. The Anunnaki become memory. Kings become function. The world continues. The silence after the overseers left. When the overseers withdrew, there was no collapse. No ash layer separates one age from the next. No abandoned cities mark the moment authority shifted. The ground did not crack. The rivers did not change course. What followed was quieter than catastrophe and more enduring than conquest. It was silence, applied carefully, sustained deliberately, and preserved across generations. In early Mesopotamian culture, silence was never accidental. Words were power. Names invoked presence. To stop speaking, a name was not to forget it, but to neutralize it. This principle governed ritual language, legal formulae, and myth transmission. When the Anunnaki ceased to be named as active authorities, their absence was not ignorance, it was policy. The earliest evidence of this silence appears not in myth, but in administration. Clay tablets from the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BCE, record temple operations with remarkable precision. Workers are listed by name, rations are measured to the smallest unit, delivery dates are exact. These documents once opened with invocations to specific divine authorities. Over time, those invocations become generalized or disappear entirely. The work continues unchanged. Only the justification is removed. This suggests that divine oversight had become unnecessary to motivate compliance. The system no longer required celestial enforcement. Human authority was sufficient. In earlier periods, the Anunnaki were embedded into procedure. A canal was dug as decreed by the Anunnaki. A boundary stone was set before the Anunnaki. These phrases established legitimacy. They placed human action within a cosmic hierarchy. By the time of centralized kingship, legitimacy no longer depended on named overseers. It depended on continuity, precedent, and force. Silence allowed that transition to appear seamless. The shift is also visible in ritual practice. Offerings continued, but their meaning changed. Early offerings were transactional. Food, drink, and incense sustained the gods who sustained the world. Later, offerings became commemorative. They honored tradition rather than necessity. The gods were remembered, not relied upon. In funerary texts, this change is especially clear. The Anunnaki appear as judges of the dead, but they do not speak, they do not argue, they do not weigh outcomes in narrative form. Their presence is static. Judgment is automatic. The dead arrive. The Anunnaki receive them. Nothing more is said. This portrayal strips them of agency. A judge who does not deliberate is not a ruler. He is a mechanism. The underworld itself reflects this transformation. In early myths, the underworld is chaotic, negotiated, contested. Gods enter and leave. Rules change. By later periods, it is fixed. No one escapes. No one intervenes. The Anunnaki preside over a closed system. Closed systems require no authority. Silence also shapes how myths are preserved. Early stories are detailed. They describe disputes, decisions, negotiations among gods. Later retellings compress these narratives. Characters merge. Motivations fade. Events become symbolic. This compression is not random. It follows the removal of relevance. When a figure no longer influences daily life, the need to understand its motives disappears. The story becomes a relic. Scribes copying older texts often altered nothing explicitly. They preserved names but not context. Over generations, this created hollow narratives. The Anunnaki remained present in lists and invocations, but their role was unclear. They became part of the past rather than the present. This process mirrors political memory. Former regimes are honored ceremonially while their policies are abandoned. Statues remain, titles persist, power moves on. Silence protects stability. Acknowledging that overseers left would raise questions. Why did they leave? Were they defeated? Could it happen again? Such questions threaten order. Silence prevents them from forming. In this way, silence becomes a tool of governance. Egypt provides a parallel example. The earliest dynastic texts depict gods interacting directly with rulers. By the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh embodies divine authority. Gods witness but do not instruct. Their silence affirms the king's role. There is no narrative of transition. The system simply exists. This absence of explanation allows legitimacy to persist without challenge. The people do not ask when gods stopped ruling. They only know who rules now. In Mesopotamia, the same logic applies. Kings claim divine favor, but they do not describe divine intervention. Success proves legitimacy. Failure is reframed as temporary imbalance. The gods remain silent. Silence also allows contradiction to be ignored. Early myths describe gods arguing, failing, regretting decisions. Such stories undermine the image of perfect authority. As kings consolidate power, these stories lose prominence. They are not erased, they are sidelined. By the Neo-Assyrian period, royal inscriptions focus on human action. Campaign routes are detailed. Engineering feats are praised, the gods are thanked, but not described as participants. They bless outcomes already achieved. This reinforces the idea that authority is human. The divine becomes an endorsement, not a command. The Anunnaki, once overseers of labor and fate, do not fit this model. Their authority was collective and procedural. Kingship demands singular command. Silence resolves this incompatibility. The absence of resistance narratives suggests that this transition was accepted. People adapt to systems that work. As long as food arrives, law functions, and order holds, the source of authority matters less. Over time, silence becomes memory. Memory becomes myth. Myth becomes background. The Anunnaki survive only where silence allows them to, in rituals that require ancient names, in texts copied for tradition, in cosmological diagrams where they occupy fixed positions. They do not evolve. Living gods evolve. Dead systems do not. This static preservation is itself evidence of displacement. Active belief adapts. Inactive belief freezes. The silence after the overseers left is therefore not emptiness. It is the sound of a system stabilizing around new assumptions. Humanity learned to rule itself without declaring independence. No proclamation was necessary. No rebellion needed recording. Authority shifted through use, not force. The Anunnaki did not vanish. They were placed where they could no longer interfere. Silence ensured that placement would never be questioned. Fragments that refused to vanish. Long after the overseers ceased to direct human affairs, traces of their presence remained. These traces did not persist as authority. They endured as fragments, isolated names, displaced symbols, unfinished stories, and rituals that continued without a clear explanation of origin. They appear across cultures and centuries, often disconnected from their original function, preserved not because they were understood, but because they were inherited. Fragments are not accidents of history. They are residues of systems that once operated fully. When a structure collapses slowly, its components do not disappear at once. They scatter. Some are repurposed. Others remain embedded in language, architecture, and habit. The Anunnaki survive in this way, not as rulers, but as impressions left behind by a system that once shaped order. One of the clearest forms of fragmentation appears in naming conventions. In early Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki are specific. They are counted, they are listed, they occupy defined roles. In later texts, their name becomes collective and vague. Sometimes it refers to a group of gods. Sometimes it refers to judges. Sometimes it is interchangeable with entirely different divine assemblies. The precision dissolves. This loss of specificity indicates that the original meaning was no longer required. When a term remains useful, but its function is forgotten, it becomes flexible. Flexibility allows survival. Precision does not. Fragments also appear in cosmology. Early descriptions place the Anunnaki between heaven and earth. They move, they descend, they interact. Later, cosmologies fix them in place. They are assigned to the underworld or to static celestial zones. Movement ends. Position replaces action. Fixed placement is a form of containment. A being that does not move cannot intervene. A judge who does not speak cannot command. These cosmological fragments preserve memory without restoring power. Ritual language preserves another layer of residue. Certain incantations invoke the Anunnaki as witnesses rather than agents. They are named at the beginning or end of a rite, but nothing is asked of them. Their presence sanctifies the action without influencing it. This pattern suggests that their names retained symbolic weight long after their operational role ended. Symbols endure when systems dissolve. Fragments also appear in architecture. Ziggurats and temples originally functioned as points of contact. They were built as interfaces between human labor and divine oversight. Over time, these structures remained, but their use shifted. Access narrowed. Rituals became internal. The building stood, but the connection it once represented no longer functioned. In later periods, temples became repositories of tradition rather than centers of governance. Priests maintained calendars. They preserved chants. They copied texts. They did not issue commands. Authority moved elsewhere. This architectural persistence, without function, mirrors the fate of the Anunnaki themselves. Mythological fragments offer further evidence. Stories survive in incomplete forms. Motifs repeat without context. A rebellion is hinted at but not described. A judgment occurs without cause. A silence follows an event that is never named. These narrative gaps are significant. They suggest that something once explained has been removed or allowed to fade. The story remains because it was once important. The explanation disappears because it no longer serves the present. In one recurring motif, humans are warned but not punished. A god complains but does not act. A boundary is crossed, but consequences are delayed or absent. These stories lack resolution. They end quietly. Unresolved narratives often indicate unresolved transitions. The system changed, but the story that explained the change was not preserved. Fragments also appear in law. Early legal codes invoke divine authority explicitly. Later, codes reference justice abstractly. The divine origin remains implied, but enforcement is human. This abstraction removes the need for named overseers. Justice becomes a concept rather than a command. Concepts do not rebel, they do not leave. Language itself carries residue. Certain phrases persist long after their literal meaning is lost. Oaths sworn before the gods remain common, even when the gods are no longer consulted. The phrase becomes ceremonial. Ceremony without belief is a fragment of belief. Across regions that never shared direct contact, similar patterns appear. Divine councils give way to singular authority. Overseers become ancestors. Ancestors become symbols. Symbols become decorations. This convergence suggests a shared process rather than a shared story. Humanity did not need to agree on what happened to the overseers. It only needed to adapt to their absence. Fragments are also preserved in art. Early depictions show gods interacting with humans. Later art emphasizes distance. Gods are larger, elevated, separated by space. They observe rather than engage. Eventually, human figures dominate scenes entirely. Visual language shifts alongside political reality. When authority changes, representation follows. Some fragments are stranger. Certain symbols appear suddenly and persist without explanation. Winged figures, hybrid forms, beings neither fully human nor animal. These images appear across cultures, often detached from narrative. Such symbols may reflect earlier concepts of overseers that no longer fit later belief systems. Without context, they become decorative or allegorical. Allegory is another form of containment. It allows a symbol to remain without threatening the present. Fragments also survive in calendar systems. Early calendars align with agricultural cycles managed through ritual consultation. Later calendars are fixed mathematically. The ritual remains, but the consultation does not. Time itself becomes human-managed. The persistence of fragments suggests that the removal of overseers was not violent. Violent removal often produces deliberate erasure. Here, memory is allowed to remain, but power is not. This selective preservation indicates control. Someone chose what to keep and what to let fade. That choice shaped historical memory. Fragments resist disappearance because they are harmless. They no longer command. They no longer demand. They are safe. Yet their very presence hints at what once existed. A fragment implies a whole. A remnant suggests a structure that preceded it. The Anunnaki endure as such remnants, not as proof of continued rule, but as evidence of a system that once required explanation. Their refusal to vanish entirely reflects the conservatism of culture. Humans rarely erase completely. They layer. Layering allows continuity. Continuity allows stability. Thus, fragments remain embedded in the foundations of civilization. They do not interfere. They do not instruct. They simply exist. Their existence is not a threat. It is a reminder. What they remind us of is not clear. The memory has been stripped of meaning. Only shape remains. The overseers left no monument to their departure. They left impressions, shadows, names without voices. Fragments that refuse to vanish do not speak of rebellion or defeat. They speak of replacement. Human systems took over. The old structures were dismantled quietly. Their components were reused where convenient and ignored where dangerous. This is how authority ends when it is outgrown, not with fire, not with war, but with silence and fragments, echoes in stone and sky. When authority no longer descended from unseen overseers, the physical world did not immediately adjust. Stone does not respond to political change. Landscapes do not rewrite themselves. What had already been measured, aligned, and raised remained fixed in place. These remnants became the quietest witnesses to a former order, one that did not speak through kings, but through orientation, proportion, and continuity. Across the ancient world, monumental architecture appears with a sudden confidence that is difficult to explain through gradual experimentation alone. In Mesopotamia, the earliest large-scale constructions are not defensive walls or palaces. They are elevated platforms. Ziggurats rise above city centers as layered forms, neither fully enclosed nor openly accessible. Their function is often described as symbolic, yet symbolism alone does not require the level of precision evident in their foundations. The earliest ziggurats were oriented carefully, their corners aligned closely with the cardinal directions. This alignment was not approximate. It required observation of the sky over long periods, correction for seasonal variation, and agreement on reference points that did not shift year to year. Such effort suggests that direction mattered in a way that went beyond aesthetics. Later ziggurats continue the form but lose exactness. Orientation becomes less precise. Proportions vary. The shape is preserved, but the discipline weakens. This pattern repeats across cultures. Precision appears early, then degrades. In Egypt, the same sequence unfolds. The earliest pyramidal structures, including the step pyramid at Saqqara, demonstrate remarkable alignment to true north. The error margin is so small that it exceeds what would be required for ritual symbolism alone. Achieving this accuracy demands sustained observation of circumpolar stars, careful measurement, and consistent methodology. Later, pyramids remain impressive, but show greater variation. Orientation errors increase. The focus shifts towards size, surface finish, and visibility. Alignment remains important, but not absolute. This decline does not indicate loss of skill. Egyptian builders continued to produce sophisticated work for centuries. Instead, it suggests that the original requirement for precision had changed. The alignment was no longer operational. It had become ceremonial. Stone preserves intent even when meaning is lost. The sky played a central role in this inherited architecture. Early monuments often align with specific stellar events rather than seasonal cycles. Some alignments correspond to the rising of stars that do not mark agricultural moments. Others point toward constellations that held meaning only within a particular cosmological framework. Tracking stars over generations requires continuity. It assumes that what is observed today will matter decades later. This assumption implies a system concerned with long-term order rather than immediate survival. In early Mesopotamian cosmology, certain divine figures were associated with fixed positions in the sky. These associations were not poetic metaphors. They were used to structure calendars, rituals, and spatial planning. When gods were active overseers, their positions mattered. As their authority faded, the sky remained, but its role shifted. Stars became markers rather than messengers. Observation continued, but interpretation changed. Egyptian astronomical ceilings reflect this transition. They map decans, star groups used to measure time during the night. These maps are precise, orderly, and detached. They do not depict interaction. They record position. Recording replaces dialogue. Stone also preserves proportion. Across unrelated regions, early monumental sites share recurring ratios in their layouts. These ratios appear in platform dimensions, enclosure boundaries, and spacing between structures. They are abstract rather than ergonomic. They do not correspond to human movement or practical use. Abstract proportion suggests inheritance. Builders followed rules they did not invent. When rules are no longer understood, they become tradition. Tradition persists until it no longer serves even symbolic function. Later builders repeat these proportions inconsistently. Ratios drift. The rule remains in name but not in execution. This degradation mirrors the fading relevance of the system that once required strict adherence. Construction techniques tell a similar story. In several regions, early stonework displays precision that later builders do not attempt to replicate. Large blocks are cut and fitted with minimal gaps. Surfaces are flattened with accuracy that requires planning and coordination. These techniques do not evolve linearly. They appear, peak, and then simplify. Later, Cultures often reuse earlier stonework rather than replicate its methods. This suggests that the original techniques served a purpose that was no longer present. When necessity ends, complexity becomes wasteful. In societies without writing, the same architectural patterns appear. Structures align with solstices, equinoxes, or specific stellar events. These alignments persist even when oral traditions no longer explain them. The builders remember how, but not why. Oral memory fades faster than stone. Some alignments serve no clear agricultural function. They do not mark planting or harvest. They do not correspond to weather cycles. They occur at moments that seem arbitrary within later cultural frameworks. Arbitrary timing suggests a lost context. As kings absorbed authority, monuments changed role. Platforms became stages for display. Tombs became expressions of permanence and power. The sky remained referenced, but no longer governed use. Alignment became a symbol of legitimacy rather than a requirement to function. This shift parallels the transition from overseer-based order to sovereign-based rule. Authority no longer needed cosmic confirmation. It needed visibility. Monuments built under the new system emphasized dominance rather than connection. Scale replaces precision. Ornament replaces orientation. Yet echoes remain. Even when function changes, builders often preserve earlier alignments out of habit or respect. The stone remembers even when the builders do not. Later cultures copy earlier forms without understanding their origins. Pyramidal shapes appear in regions without shared myth. Ziggurat-like structures rise in contexts where their original purpose is unknown. The form persists because it signifies antiquity and authority. Echoes become markers of legitimacy. The persistence of these architectural choices suggests that the overseers did not leave behind texts explaining their departure. They left infrastructure. Humans adapted it. Stone does not argue. It does not demand explanation. It endures. The sky does not intervene. It follows its cycles. Together, stone and sky preserve a memory that language no longer carries. A system once existed that required alignment, permanence, and abstraction. When that system ended, its physical expressions remained embedded in the world. These echoes do not instruct. They do not command. They simply exist, raising questions without offering answers. The silence of the overseers allowed these remnants to persist without challenge. No one needed to dismantle them. Their meaning had already shifted. What remains is not proof of continued authority, but evidence of a former one. Stone remembers what humans choose not to record. The sky continues its patterns without regard for belief. Between them lies a quiet record of a world that once required oversight and learned to continue without it. The last memory of those who came before. When the overseers no longer acted, memory did not vanish with them. It thinned, it stretched, it bent around new realities. What survived was not history, but impression, not explanation, but unease. The last memory of those who came before was carried not in records, but in tone. Oral tradition preserved what written systems did not. Spoken memory is selective. It favors repetition, rhythm, and warning. Details fade. Structure remains. In many early societies, stories about gods who once ruled directly over humans persist long after those gods lose names, faces, or clear roles. What remains is the idea that something greater once stood closer to the world. These stories rarely describe departure. They describe distance. The gods move away. They retreat to the sky, the mountains, or the underworld. They stop answering. Humans are left to manage the world alone. This pattern appears across cultures that never shared language or contact. The consistency lies not in the characters, but in the direction of change. Authority moves upward or inward. Direct presence becomes remote oversight. oversight becomes silence. In Mesopotamian tradition, later myths describe a time when gods walked openly among humans. These stories are not dated. They are placed before kingship or before cities. The lack of chronology removes them from measurable history. They become timeless. Timelessness is a way to contain memory. What cannot be dated cannot be questioned. As these stories are retold, agency fades. Early versions include instruction, command, and consequence. Later versions focus on boundary and prohibition. Humans are warned not to cross certain lines. The reason is often unclear. The authority behind the warning is distant. This change suggests that the memory of oversight remained, even as its function dissolved. People remembered that rules once came from elsewhere, even if they no longer knew where or why. In many traditions, this memory takes the form of a fall. Humans are said to have lost access to divine presence through disobedience, noise, curiosity, or ambition. The details vary. The outcome is the same. Separation becomes permanent. Separation narratives explain absence without requiring conflict. They place responsibility on humanity rather than on the overseers. This preserves order. If gods withdrew because humans changed, then the system remains justified. Such narratives appear in the Atrahasis epic, in later flood traditions, and in myths where divine beings limit contact after a crisis. The gods do not disappear, they withdraw. Withdrawal implies choice. It avoids the implication of defeat. Over time, these stories lose specificity. The overseers are no longer named. They become the gods, the ancestors, or those above. Their individuality dissolves. Their actions become archetypal. Archetypes endure longer than identities. In regions without writing, similar patterns emerge. Elders speak of an earlier age when beings of great power taught humans how to live. These beings are described as tall, bright, or distant. They leave after humans grow numerous or careless. They promise to return, but never do. Promises of return preserve hope while explaining absence. Inherited fear is another residue of memory. Certain actions are avoided without clear reason. Certain places are treated with caution. Certain times are considered dangerous. These prohibitions often lack narrative explanation. They are followed because they always have been. Fear without explanation suggests a forgotten cause. In Mesopotamian incantations, some threats are described in vague terms. A punishment will come, as in the old days. The phrase is never defined. It assumes shared memory. As generations pass, shared memory becomes shared assumption. No one remembers the event. Everyone remembers the rule. This process strips memory of detail while preserving effect. The Anunnaki, once active overseers, survive in this way. Their names appear in contexts of judgment, boundary, and finality. They are associated with the dead, with fate, with what cannot be appealed. They are not described as teachers. They are not described as guides. They are described as witnesses. A witness observes but does not intervene. In later texts, the Anunnaki are sometimes grouped with ancestors. This blending suggests that their otherness had diminished. They were no longer clearly separate from human memory. When gods become ancestors, authority becomes heritage rather than command. This transition is subtle but profound. Heritage can be honored. It cannot enforce. Oral traditions often preserve this shift as loss of closeness. The world is said to be colder, harsher, or quieter than before. Humans must work harder. They must make their own decisions. These descriptions align with the rise of self-governance. They frame autonomy as consequence rather than achievement. Framing autonomy as loss prevents rebellion against it. If the old order was better but gone, the present must be endured. Silence plays a role here as well. Stories about the overseers often end abruptly. They do not explain how things changed. They simply state that they did. Abrupt endings prevent inquiry. In many cultures, the last memory of divine presence is preserved in taboo. Certain knowledge is forbidden. Certain names are not spoken. Certain acts are restricted. These taboos often lack context. Taboo without context is a remnant of control without authority. The overseers no longer enforce, but the rules remain. This is how systems persist after power shifts. Enforcement becomes internal, memory becomes discipline. By the time written history becomes dominant, these oral fragments are already distorted. Scribes record them as myth, not memory. They categorize them as symbolic, not factual. This categorization further distances the past. Myth is safe. History invites challenge. Thus, the last memory of those who came before is preserved in softened form. It does not accuse. It does not warn explicitly. It suggests. Suggestion is enough. The overseers are remembered not as rulers, but as a time when the world was different, closer, more ordered, less human. That memory lingers because it serves a purpose. It explains why the world requires effort. It explains why authority is now human. It explains why silence exists where command once stood. The memory does not need to be accurate. It needs to be functional. Over generations, function replaces fact. The Anunnaki become shadows in language. Their presence is felt but not examined. Their authority is implied but not tested. They remain because forgetting them entirely would raise questions. Remembering them too clearly would raise others. Between these extremes lies myth. The last memory of those who came before is therefore not a story of war or destruction. It is a story of distance. They were here, they are not now, and the world learned to continue. When silence became law, when the overseers no longer issued commands, order did not dissolve. It settled. What had once arrived from elsewhere began to form within the structure of daily life. Silence did not create confusion. It created consistency. Over time, that consistency hardened into expectation, and expectation hardened into law. In the earliest human communities, rules existed before writing. They were not debated, they were repeated. A boundary was respected because it had always been respected. A ritual was performed because deviation invited risk, even if the reason for that risk was no longer remembered. Authority was not questioned because it did not need to speak. It was assumed. As divine instruction faded from direct experience, this assumption did not disappear. It transferred. The source of order shifted from the unseen to the habitual. What mattered was no longer who commanded, but that the command had always been followed. This shift is visible in the first surviving law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, compiled around 2100 BCE, does not read like divine revelation. It reads like procedure. Crimes are listed, penalties are defined, compensation is measured. The language is calm and exact. The gods are acknowledged, but they do not intervene. They do not argue cases. They do not appear in the process. Justice operates without dialogue. Later codes expand this structure. The laws of Lipit Ishtar and Hammurabi cover more situations, but they preserve the same tone. There is no uncertainty. Each action produces a known result. The law does not ask permission. It applies. Hammurabi's famous stele depicts the king receiving law from a god, yet the laws themselves do not describe divine involvement. The image legitimizes, the text governs. Once established, the system functions independently. This separation between origin and operation is significant. It indicates a society no longer waiting for correction from above. Order must be maintained continuously. Silence requires structure. Moral expectations evolve alongside legal ones. Earlier moral systems rely on divine approval. An action is wrong because it offends the gods. As oversight fades, morality becomes social. An action is wrong because it disrupts balance, family, or reputation. Proverbs from later Mesopotamian periods reflect this change. They warn against greed, arrogance, and dishonesty, not because gods will strike, but because consequences will follow. A dishonest person loses trust. An arrogant one loses allies. The punishment is communal. The gods are no longer needed to enforce restraint. Society does it more efficiently. This internalization of rule is essential in large populations. External oversight does not scale. Internal discipline does. Silence enables this shift by removing dependence on response. Religious practice adapts accordingly. Rituals continue, but their function changes. They no longer secure intervention. They reinforce identity and continuity. The act itself matters more than the outcome. Prayer becomes repetition rather than request. In Egypt, this transformation is expressed through the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at represents order, balance, and truth, but it does not issue commands. It exists as a standard. The pharaoh upholds it. Officials administer it. Citizens live within it. Ma'at does not speak. It does not threaten. Its authority lies in permanence. This abstraction allows stability without oversight. When order is a principle rather than a voice, it cannot withdraw. Silence makes principles possible. As societies grow more complex, abstraction becomes necessary. Millions of people cannot be governed through divine conversation. They require predictable systems. Silence removes uncertainty. Imperial administrations demonstrate this clearly. Assyrian and Persian systems rely on record-keeping, taxation, and standardized procedure. Gods are invoked ceremonially, but governance is mechanical. The empire functions regardless of belief. Divine silence removes liability. If a harvest fails, it is a logistical issue, not a theological one. If rebellion occurs, it is political, not cosmic. Authority becomes human and accountable only to outcome. Over time, silence itself acquires weight. Certain questions are no longer asked. Origins are no longer discussed. The system simply exists as it is. This absence of questioning stabilizes order. When people stop waiting for answers, they act. Silence also prevents fracture. Competing divine voices once introduced contradiction. Without them, law becomes singular. Disagreement exists, but it is resolved through procedure rather than appeal. The overseers are no longer required because their function has been absorbed. What they once enforced externally is now embedded internally. Custom replaces command. Habit replaces instruction. Law replaces voice. Silence ensures continuity by removing interruption. In this way, silence did not weaken civilization. It completed it. The world learned to govern itself without listening upward, a world that no longer waited. In the earliest periods of human memory, time moved according to signals. The world was watched more than it was shaped. Rivers were observed, skies were read, seasons were accepted, action followed confirmation. People waited because something else was believed to decide when movement was allowed. Waiting was not passivity, it was obedience. When the overseers still mattered, waiting was built into survival. Fields were planted only after signs aligned. Journeys began when omens permitted. Conflict paused during sacred intervals. The future was not something to be designed, it was something to be received. Even kings waited. Authority operated within limits set by forces that were not questioned. As silence replaced instruction, this posture slowly changed. The shift did not begin with ambition. It began with necessity. When no answer came, delay became dangerous. Crops could not wait for permission when seasons advanced regardless. Cities could not pause expansion while populations grew. Threats did not announce themselves through ritual channels. They arrived when they arrived. The absence of response forced a change in behavior. Humans began to act first and explain later. This change is visible in the structure of early records. The oldest tablets describe completed events. They record what was given, what was lost, what occurred. Over time, tablets begin to describe what will be needed. Grain is allocated months in advance. Labor is scheduled ahead of seasonal cycles. Construction projects are planned across years. Time is no longer reactive. It is segmented, predicted, and controlled. This transformation required trust not in overseers, but in systems. A system can fail, but it does not hesitate. Silence made hesitation costly. The world did not pause while people waited for meaning. Calendars reflect this change clearly. Early calendars are ritual devices. They mark festivals and sacred intervals. Later calendars become administrative tools. They divide the year for taxation, labor rotation, and storage. Sacred days remain, but they no longer determine action. They decorate it. Astronomy undergoes a similar transition. Early observation seeks intention. Stars are read as signals. Movements are interpreted as communication. Later observation seeks pattern. The sky becomes predictable. Tables replace interpretation. Eclipses are anticipated years in advance. When an eclipse is calculated, it no longer interrupts order, it confirms it. Fear dissolves when surprise disappears. The same pattern emerges in agriculture. Early farming adapts to conditions as they appear. Later, farming anticipates conditions before they occur. Irrigation systems are built to manage water rather than respond to it. Storage is expanded to absorb uncertainty. Preparation replaces prayer. In Egypt, this future-oriented thinking reaches its clearest expression. Monumental projects are designed to outlast generations. Pyramids require decades of coordination. Stone must be quarried, transported, shaped, and placed according to plans that will never be completed by their designers. Such planning assumes continuity. It assumes that no external authority will interrupt the process. It assumes that the world will remain stable enough for intention to carry forward. A civilization that still waits for instruction cannot commit to such scale. Political behavior changes alongside infrastructure. Early rulers react to events. Later rulers legislate for contingencies. Laws include provisions for situations that have not yet occurred. Treaties account for future disputes. Succession is planned. Planning for succession is a critical indicator. It assumes that authority is not fragile. It assumes that the system will persist beyond individuals. Waiting is replaced by anticipation. This anticipatory mindset reshapes education. Knowledge is no longer transmitted only through imitation. It is formalized. Apprentices are trained according to standards. Skills are preserved intentionally for people not yet born. Preservation of knowledge assumes that the future will exist in recognizable form. Religion adapts to this orientation. Revelation becomes rare. Orthodoxy becomes central. Correct practice matters more than new instruction. Stability is valued over novelty. A world that waits expects interruption. A world that plans expects continuity. Silence makes continuity believable. Even warfare reflects this shift. Early conflicts are ritualized and limited. Later conflicts are strategic and prolonged. Supply chains are developed. Fortifications anticipate siege rather than respond to attack. Victory is engineered over time. Engineering requires confidence that conditions will remain stable long enough to matter. Memory changes as well. The past is no longer consulted to determine what will happen next. It is consulted to understand what has worked before. History becomes precedent rather than prophecy. Myth changes function. It no longer predicts. It explains. It justifies. It anchors identity. The future belongs to calculation. This does not eliminate belief. It relocates it. Belief becomes background rather than guidance. It supports action instead of delaying it. Silence allows this relocation. Without constant instruction, action becomes default. Responsibility follows. When disasters occur, they are no longer framed as divine messages. They are treated as failures of planning or execution. Floods demand better levees. Disease demands containment. Famine demands storage. Blame shifts inward. This inward shift marks the final separation from overseer-based order. Humanity no longer expects rescue. It prepares. Preparation becomes virtue. The world that no longer waited is not louder. It is steadier. It moves forward on schedules it has created. It measures progress in years, not signs. The overseers once defined limits. Their absence required humans to define their own. Those limits became invisible through repetition. Invisible limits are more powerful than spoken ones. By the time classical civilizations emerge, waiting has become inefficiency. Philosophy replaces prophecy. Strategy replaces omen. Systems replace appeal. Humanity moves forward without looking upward. The silence does not feel empty anymore. It feels normal, and in that normality, the transformation is complete. Not because the overseers were defeated, but because they were no longer necessary. The world learned to continue on its own. The question that remains, even after authority had fully settled into human hands, after law replaced command and planning replaced waiting, something unresolved remained beneath the surface of civilization. It did not disrupt daily life. It did not undo progress. It did not prevent cities from rising or systems from stabilizing. It persisted quietly, carried forward not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be lived with. The question that remained was not whether humanity could govern itself. That had been proven repeatedly. Societies endured without direct oversight. They expanded, adapted, and survived through their own structures. The question was subtler and more persistent. It concerned meaning rather than function. It asked whether the world, now entirely managed by human systems, still pointed towards something beyond itself. This question did not arise from failure. It emerged precisely because systems worked. When survival no longer depended on divine instruction, when disasters could be mitigated and uncertainty reduced, space opened for reflection. Efficiency removed urgency. Stability allowed thought. In earlier ages, when instruction was believed to come from outside, meaning was assumed. It did not need to be examined. Purpose was inherited. Action followed command. The overseers, whether real or imagined, carried the weight of justification. Humans obeyed within limits they did not define. Once those limits dissolved into silence, justification became internal. Systems explained how things worked, but not why they mattered. Law regulated behavior. Planning ensured continuity. Knowledge expanded capability. None of these answered the deeper question of significance. This gap appears early in written literature. In Mesopotamia, wisdom texts begin to reflect unease that cannot be resolved through ritual or obedience. The righteous suffer, the careful fail, the reckless succeed. The gods are not accused directly, but their absence is implied. No response comes. The text, often known as the Babylonian Theodicy, presents a dialogue between a sufferer and a friend. The friend insists that order exists. The sufferer observes that experience contradicts it. The gods are distant. The conversation ends without resolution. Silence remains. Such texts would not exist in a world where instruction was still expected. They assume that no answer will arrive. In Egypt, similar reflections appear in writings sometimes called pessimistic literature. Order is praised. Balance is urged. Yet beneath these instructions lies an acknowledgement that harmony must be maintained actively. It does not arrive naturally. The gods uphold order, but humans must enforce it. Enforcement implies responsibility. As responsibility increased, so did the burden of choice. Decisions no longer carried the comfort of divine mandate. They carried consequences that could not be deferred. Success and failure belonged to human action. This shift produced progress, but it also produced unease. Across cultures, memory responded by idealizing the past. Stories emerged of earlier ages when the world was closer to perfection. These golden ages are not described as advanced, they are described as aligned. Humans lived in proximity to guidance. Rules were fewer. Effort was lighter. These stories do not describe how such ages ended. They simply state that they did. Separation becomes permanent. The reason varies. Sometimes it is disobedience, sometimes noise, sometimes ambition. The common result is distance. Distance explains silence without implying defeat. These narratives appear independently across civilizations. Their consistency suggests a shared psychological response rather than a shared historical event. As autonomy increased, memory generated stories that placed meaning behind humanity rather than ahead of it. Meaning became something that had been lost rather than something yet to be found. This framing served a function. If meaning once existed fully, then its absence could be endured. It did not need to be created from nothing. It had merely receded. The question that remained, therefore, took a particular form. It did not ask how to restore oversight. It asked whether human systems alone were enough to sustain significance. This question shaped philosophy. In Greece, thinkers turned inward not because gods vanished, but because divine silence left space. They asked what justice was when no voice defined it. They asked what virtue meant when no punishment followed immediately. They asked how to live well in a world governed by law rather than decree. Philosophy did not replace religion. It complemented it by addressing what silence revealed. As empires expanded, the question persisted. Roman writers praised order, law, and administration. Yet they also reflected on emptiness, decay, and moral exhaustion. Power did not resolve doubt. Stability did not eliminate longing. This tension appears in later religious movements as well. New belief systems emphasized internal transformation rather than external command. Salvation moved inward. Conscience replaced decree. The divine voice relocated to the self. This adaptation preserved meaning without restoring overseers. Yet even internalized belief required reinforcement. Ritual, community, and repetition remained necessary. Meaning could be generated internally, but it needed structure to persist. The persistence of structure reveals the question beneath it. If meaning were fully self-sustaining, reinforcement would not be required. The memory of overseers endured because it symbolized a time when meaning arrived complete. Humans did not need to justify purpose. They inherited it. Autonomy removed that inheritance. It replaced it with responsibility. Responsibility requires justification. Justification requires narrative. This is why stories of former overseers never vanished. They did not threaten autonomy. They contextualized it. They allowed humanity to see itself not as abandoned, but as advanced beyond dependence. The overseers became symbols of childhood. Their absence marked maturity. Maturity brings freedom. It also brings isolation. The question that remains is therefore not about return, it is about reconciliation. Can a world governed entirely by human systems sustain a sense of meaning that does not collapse under its own weight? Civilizations answer this question differently. Some elevate abstraction. Concepts such as justice, progress, and destiny take on near-sacred status. Others elevate ideology. Belief in collective purpose replaces belief in divine command. These replacements function because they resemble what came before. They are external frameworks that guide behavior. They do not speak, but they compel. The question persists because replacements are never identical to what they replace. Something is always altered in translation. Silence allowed humanity to grow. It also removed certainty. The question remains because certainty cannot be fully reconstructed once it is lost. And so civilizations continue, efficient and capable, building systems that function without instruction, while carrying within them a quiet awareness that something once stood closer to the world than systems ever can. This awareness does not halt progress. It shapes reflection. The overseers do not need to exist for the question to persist. Silence is enough. What replaced the gods? When the overseers no longer governed the world directly, the space they left behind did not remain open for long. Human societies do not tolerate vacuum at the center of authority. Order requires reference. Direction requires justification. When divine command faded into silence, something else moved quietly into its place. The replacement did not arrive as a single invention. It emerged gradually, layered over generations, shaped by necessity rather than design. No one announced it. No council approved it. It formed because life continued, and continuity demanded structure. The first replacement was law. Law succeeded where divine command could no longer function because it required no presence. A god must be heard to rule. Law only needs to be remembered. Once written, law exists independently of voice, mood, or withdrawal. It does not answer questions. It applies outcomes. Early law codes reflect this transformation clearly. The Code of Ur-Nammu, compiled around 2100 BCE, does not resemble revelation. It resembles calibration. Each action produces a known response. Injury has a price. Theft has a consequence. Status modifies outcome, but the rule remains consistent. The gods appear only as guarantors, not as judges. By the time of Hammurabi, this structure is fully established. The king claims divine approval, but the laws do not rely on divine intervention. There is no appeal to omen, prayer, or interpretation. The system functions on its own. This autonomy made law powerful. It was predictable. Predictability generates trust. Trust produces obedience. Over time, law acquired traits once reserved for gods. It became impersonal. It became permanent. It became unquestionable in practice, even when debated in theory. To violate law was not merely to break a rule, it was to disrupt order. Stone inscriptions reinforce this transformation. Laws carved into stelae conveyed endurance. What was written in stone appeared timeless. Timelessness commands reverence. Stone replaced voice. As law stabilized behavior, abstraction replaced personality. Authority no longer needed a face. It needed continuity. This allowed societies to expand without fracturing. Millions could obey the same code without ever encountering its source. The second replacement was kingship redefined. Early kings ruled as intermediaries. Later kings ruled as embodiments of order. They no longer waited for instruction. They executed structure. Their authority came not from divine conversation, but from system maintenance. Even when rulers claimed divine ancestry, their power was exercised administratively. They taxed, recorded, legislated, and enforced. The gods sanctified the throne, but they did not manage the state. This distinction mattered. It allowed governance to survive weak rulers. The system endured even when individuals failed. Over time, kingship itself became symbolic. In some societies, the ruler embodied order. In others, the ruler became subordinate to law. Either way, authority detached from divine presence. The third replacement was ideology. As societies grew larger and more complex, law alone could not justify hierarchy. People obey rules more willingly when they believe those rules serve a greater purpose. Ideology provided that purpose. Ideology explained why a society existed, not just how it functioned. It defined enemies. It defined virtue. It justified sacrifice. It offered belonging. Ideologies share key characteristics with gods. They define good and evil. They demand loyalty. They promise meaning beyond individual life. They punish deviation. Unlike gods, ideologies do not withdraw. They persist as long as they are taught. In Mesopotamia, ideology took the form of divinely favored kingship and cosmic order. In Egypt, it became Ma'at, an abstract principle elevated above personality. In later empires, it became destiny, empire, civilization itself. Destiny does not speak, but it commands. As writing spread, ideology became embedded in narrative. Histories were written to legitimize present power. Founding stories explained why authority existed. Myth merged with record. Narrative replaced revelation. Philosophy emerged as another replacement, addressing questions silence exposed. When gods no longer explained justice, philosophers attempted to define it. When command faded, reasoning rose. Philosophy provided frameworks rather than instructions. It did not claim divine origin, it claimed coherence. This made it adaptable. Adaptability allowed survival. Philosophical systems shaped ethics, governance, and identity. They defined virtue as balance, reason, or duty. These concepts functioned like laws of the mind. They guided behavior without external enforcement. The overseers once defined limits externally. Philosophy internalized them. Science eventually joined these replacements, not as meaning, but as authority over explanation. Natural law replaced divine will. Predictability replaced mystery. The world no longer happened because it was decided. It happened because it followed rules. Rules do not negotiate. Science did not eliminate belief. It reoriented trust. People trusted systems that produced consistent results. This trust resembled faith, even when framed as skepticism. Trust is obedience justified by reliability. As these replacements layered, they formed a complete structure of authority without overseers. Law governed behavior. Ideology justified purpose. Philosophy shaped values. Science explained mechanism. Together, they filled the space left by divine command. The reverence once reserved for gods shifted accordingly. Constitutions replaced commandments. Flags replaced idols. Progress replaced salvation. Certain ideas became untouchable. Questioning them provoked emotional response. Anger, fear, disbelief. These reactions mirror religious defense. Taboo survived the transition. Even in modern societies that reject divine authority explicitly, sacred structures remain. Certain values are treated as absolute. Certain narratives are protected from doubt. Certain systems are trusted beyond evidence. When these systems fail, the reaction resembles crisis of faith rather than policy disagreement. This continuity reveals something essential. Humanity did not abandon the need for overseers. It reconfigured it. The function of the gods was not to exist, but to organize meaning, obedience, and order. When gods withdrew, those functions did not disappear. They migrated. Migration preserves stability. Yet no replacement fully resolved the question that remained. Systems regulate behavior effectively. They do not answer why existence should matter. Ideologies inspire action. They do not remove doubt. Science explains mechanism. It does not address purpose. This gap ensures that replacement is never final. New abstractions rise as old ones weaken. New ideologies form when previous ones collapse. The process repeats. The overseers did not return. Their role did. Humanity learned to build structures that behave like gods without claiming divinity. These structures demand loyalty, define reality, and punish deviation. They are silent. Silence makes them powerful. What replaced the gods was not belief, but architecture of authority. A framework capable of enduring without presence. And within that framework, humanity continues to function, obey, question, and rebuild, carrying forward the ancient impulse to locate meaning outside itself, even as it insists that it no longer needs to. The end of the overseers, or the beginning. If the disappearance of the overseers marked an ending, it was not the kind history usually records. There was no collapse, no final confrontation, no moment that separated one age cleanly from the next. What ended did not fall, it dissolved, and because it dissolved slowly, it left open a question that still has no fixed answer. Was this the conclusion of a long dependency, or the first stage of a cycle that never truly stopped? From the perspective of structure, the overseers are gone. Authority no longer descends from figures outside the human world. Law governs without voices. Systems operate without instruction. Meaning is generated, defended, and revised internally. By every measurable standard, humanity moved beyond the need for external command. Yet history does not move in straight lines. It moves in patterns. Across eras, whenever systems grow too complex to question, they begin to resemble what they replaced. Laws harden into dogma. Ideologies become unquestionable. Institutions acquire moral weight beyond their function. Dissent is framed not as disagreement, but as disorder. These are not failures of progress. They are symptoms of a recurring structure. The overseers once provided certainty. Their silence forced humanity to create certainty for itself. Over time, those creations begin to feel external again, not because they are, but because their complexity places them beyond individual influence. When a system becomes too large to challenge, it becomes invisible. When it becomes invisible, it feels inevitable. And inevitability is the defining trait once attributed to gods. This is where the cycle becomes difficult to separate from linear history. The overseers were not only rulers, they were explanations. They accounted for suffering, order, and limitation. When they withdrew, humanity replaced explanation with structure. But structure, over time, becomes explanation in its own right. This raises the possibility that the overseers were not unique beings, but placeholders for a recurring human need. When uncertainty exceeds tolerance, authority externalizes. When authority becomes silent or oppressive, autonomy grows. When autonomy grows heavy, new forms of external authority emerge. The cycle does not require memory of the previous form. It only requires repetition of the function. This pattern can be seen even within recorded history. Empires collapse, not when order disappears, but when meaning fractures. New systems rise, promising clarity. They centralize authority. They simplify complexity. Over time, they become distant, rigid, and silent. The process repeats. In this sense, the overseers may not represent a lost past, but a phase. A phase humanity enters whenever control, meaning, and obedience must be unified quickly. The difference now is scale. Earlier overseers were mythic. Later replacements were institutional. Modern ones are abstract. Algorithms, markets, data-driven systems, and global structures operate without voice or presence. They decide outcomes, they shape behavior. They cannot be appealed to directly. They are silent. This silence is familiar. People respond to these systems with language once reserved for divine forces. They are said to be unstoppable, neutral, objective, beyond individual control. When they fail, the reaction is disbelief. When they succeed, the credit is abstract. This resemblance does not imply intention. It implies recurrence. The end of the overseers, then, may not have been an end at all. It may have been the first time humanity completed a transition it would later repeat under different names. What changes is not the structure, but the explanation. In early ages, authority was externalized as beings. Later, it was externalized as law. Later still, as ideology. Eventually, as system. Each step removed personality, but preserved function. The overseers were not defeated, they were refined. This perspective reframes the original question. Did humanity kill the Anunnaki? There is no evidence of destruction. What appears instead is absorption. Their role was taken over, piece by piece, until nothing remained that required them to exist as separate entities. In that sense, humanity did not end the overseers. It internalized them. And internalized authority does not disappear. It transforms. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was a transition into self-regulation. Over time, self-regulation produced structures that felt external again. The distance returned, even without gods. This suggests that the cycle is not about belief, but about scale. When systems outgrow individual comprehension, they feel other. When they feel other, they regain the qualities once assigned to overseers. Thus, the beginning and the end converge. The overseers vanish when humanity can manage itself. They return in different form when management becomes impersonal again. The cycle does not require memory of Anunnaki, gods, or myths. It only requires complexity, silence, and dependence. Whether this cycle continues indefinitely is an open question. History suggests it does. Each generation believes it has escaped external authority, only to discover it has rebuilt it in another shape. The overseers are gone, the structure remains, and the silence continues, not as absence, but as a condition humanity keeps recreating. Because order without voice is efficient, stable, and difficult to resist. If this is the end, it is not final. If it is the beginning, it has already happened before, and the world moves forward, governed by systems that no longer speak, yet shape everything, just as the overseers once did quietly, continuously, and without asking to be remembered. If this journey helped you slow down, reflect, or see ancient history in a new way, consider supporting the channel by liking the video or subscribing. These long-form explorations take time to create, and your support helps keep them going. If you'd like to continue, the next chapter explores what replaced the gods and why those replacements may feel just as distant. Let the video play, rest your mind, and we'll continue.